Welcome back to Good Evening on this beautiful Wednesday night. It is time for our segment, and Christine is in the studio for When Monet Meets Debussy. Welcome.
Thanks for having me. It's good to see you inside here.
It is good to see you outside the offices, right? And inside the studio,
Inside the studio,
yes.
yeah. Yeah, so just to tell you a little bit about this segment, Monet Meets Debussy is about us talking about artworks and some ideas or themes that come up. We've been covering quite a different spectrum of art, from more historical pieces to contemporary pieces as well. And today I want to talk about something that's a little bit different from what we usually talk about with Eric here. So we've been looking at a lot of paintings and installations, other various media, some that actually fail our efforts for categorization, but we have yet to talk about a work that would strictly be considered performance art.
Interesting, and that's definitely kind of a hard one to cover in auditory medium like this one, but I'm sure we're going to give it a good try.
Yes.
So it is very abstract and falls into the realm of modern art, which completely honestly, I don't sometimes completely understand. So guide me, walk me through. So let's get into it. So please give us a description of the work that we'll be talking about tonight.
Sure. There's a large section of the floor on one corner of the atrium that's been taped off into a square area. The atrium is a huge open space with high ceilings. This section of the space, while in the size of a small room, can be seen by everyone passing through as they enter the exhibitions, walk through the halls above, or on their way to the gift shop or cafe. On each corner of the square area are these big studio lights, like the ones photographers use as if they were a makeshift set of a shoot. In the center of the square area are two wooden chairs without armrests facing each other and a small wooden table in between. On one side, the artist is seated and her arms with long trailing sleeves are folded over her lap. She's wearing a long red dress with a mock neck and her black hair is braided on one side. A crowd of spectators gather around the square, and on one edge is a line forming, waiting to take the seat across from her. As the man sitting on the seat gets up, the artist drops her head down and closes her eyes. When she lifts her head back up and opens her eyes, she finds another visitor seated in front of her, and the two lock eyes. They both sit still with their gaze fixed on each other in silence, as the crowd around them intently watch this simple gesture. It is as if they were witnessing a powerful phenomenological connection between the artist and her audience.
Wow, that was very powerful. It was quite theatrical, meaning that it was in one part just dramatic, this representation of the scene, but also the content sounded like a piece of theater, meaning it was just like staged in front of an audience, which is, in a way, performance art sometimes is, but just off of the stage and without that fourth wall between the performer and the audience.
That's right.
So what is the title of this artwork that we'll be discussing?
So this performance is by the artist Marina Abramovich. It lasted for 3 months at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. It's titled The Artist is Present, and it was shown as part of her retrospective at the Museum of MoMA. And it was also the retrospective was by the same name. Now, she sat for 700 hours for this over the course of her exhibit.
Wow.
It lasted from March to May in 2010, and it was 7 hours a day, nearly every day, and she sat with any interested visitor for as long as they desired for that day. So it could be from 30 seconds, maybe even 7 seconds,
wow,
to 7 hours. Yeah, it's, very simple, but it was immensely popular. It drew thousands of people at the time, and some really notable artists and celebrities came and sat with her as well, including people like Sharon Stone and Lady Gaga.
Interesting. And while it is certainly fascinating, like I mentioned earlier, modern art sometimes can confuse the spectators or lay people, including myself, because the line is very blurred between what makes it art versus commercial or something that wouldn't be considered art in day-to-day life. So what makes sitting with people a form of art?
Yeah, that's a good question. So just to talk briefly about the course of art history these days. So modern art with a capital M would be considered in the 20th century. And that's when a lot of artists did ask, what is art? But nowadays we're into what they're calling the contemporary art phase. So even though it is modern times.
Right.
And nowadays the question isn't necessarily what is art. It's anything can be art, but how are we choosing to engage with it? So it's art as long as we accept it to be art. And, this actually, like you said, it's very unusual. It's not really art. So I want to explain a little bit. In art, there is usually a medium that we talk about, right? Watercolor, pencil, or clay. And for performance art, it's a little bit different from performing arts because the medium of visual arts becomes the body. So the artist usually uses their own body and does things to their body or with their body, and also talks about their body. So the body is the material and also the subject matter. And they ask things like what can be made using the body as material for art, and they like to explore the meaning of our bodies, ideas around the body, and sometimes really push the body to its limits.
I see. So definitely that is what happened in this case, sitting for 7 hours. You said for about 3 months, correct?
Yeah.
I see. So I'm very curious about the artist herself and what may have motivated her to do this. So what kind of a person is she?
So Marina Abramovich, she's actually considered, one of her titles is the grandmother of performance art. Performance art started popping up here and there around the world in the 60s. And she started making these works that were basically performance art, but she had no idea because she was living in Yugoslavia at the time. It's now Serbia, I believe.
Right.
And she lived in a very different place. She was really isolated. She grew up with both of her parents being national heroes of the communist state. And so she had this very cold and strict upbringing from them. And then it was contrasted with the more loving side of her grandmother, who was always there. And her grandmother was deeply spiritual.
I see.
So, it takes a lot of patience and endurance to sit for 700 hours, right?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, so that's maybe more of her stricter upbringing. She said that she would be sleeping in her room and her mom would wake her up and say, you're sleeping in such a messy way. Clean yourself up.
Oh, my goodness.
That's the type of environment she was in. But she's also really interested in more spiritual sides of things as well. And, her earlier works were about this type of strictness, taking risks with her body. And she was often making these really scary, dangerous works, putting her body in these scenarios. And she was interested in religious rituals that were based on testing the limits of our fear. And she would do things like flogging, which is very terrifying to think about.
Unusual and scary, yes.
Yes. But then in the 70s, she met someone called Ule, who is a German artist. And they started working together. They became longtime lovers. They, I believe, were together for 12 years. And they were also artistic partners. And it was quite unusual because artists are very egocentric, if I could say that. They're all, focused on what their vision is. So it's very rare to see two artists share the same vision and make works together.
So they were kind of partners rather than a muse and an artist, correct?
That's right, yeah. And it's very interesting to think about. They talk about each other as twins, and this was the period where she made some of the most powerful works in her career.
And what could they be, for instance?
Yeah, so her shortest piece actually lasted only 40 seconds. It's called Rest Energy. And the two of them were standing facing each other with their feet touching, and they were leaning back. And with their hands, the only thing that was holding them back from falling to the floor was this bow and arrow, and it was pointed towards her heart. So literally, the image of Cupid's bow.
Right.
And it's quite a morbid interpretation of it.
Could be fatal, yes.
Yeah. And, the only thing that was protecting her from being struck in her heart was her partner, Ule. So she had to really rely on him, and it was an exercise of extreme trust.
Very metaphorical yet literal interpretation of their relationship, I have to say.
And so, you can see from here she's already interested in meanings of connection, how our relationships affect us, and the type of problems that might arise from being able to trust someone or putting yourself in a vulnerable position.
I see.
But, in comparison to that, the artist's present seems a lot more tame. It's much more simpler.
Safer, it seems, at least, in part.
Yeah, and, so I was really curious about that, what makes this just as powerful, because she chose this as, her representative work for her retrospective at the MoMA. It's a massive occasion. It's one of her biggest recent works. And it really shows that she honed in on the essence of her art practice. So before, where she was focused more on taking physical risks and pushing her, her boundaries and how far she can go. Now she's more interested in the psychological aspect of things.
I see. So, but the thing is, this could also be, she's putting herself in a vulnerable position as well, although not physically, now psychologically. So how has that affected her?
Yeah, that's a good question. What's so risky about this might be a question. And one thing we've been talking about is it's not easy to sit still for that long. And she says that she went through months, I think over a year of training for this.
Really?
And she said it was a lot of, mental training as well as physical training.
Oh.
And also, a lot of performance art pieces are about endurance. I used to work at a performance art gallery, and we had one artist who, what she did was she dug a hole on the ground and she stuck her head in it, and she was dressed in business attire, and her piece was titled 9 to 5. So that was her job. She was standing there with her suitcase, 9 to 5, because she's an artist and that's what she gets paid for. But it's really interesting to think about the things that we do with our body.
Yes.
And trying to put those in sometimes literal situations or very unusual situations to bring new conversations about. And usually, when an artist is making a work with a painting or something, they're interacting with their audience. But with performance art, there's less of a distance, because with traditional medium, you are, removed from the interaction that your audience has with your artwork.
Right.
But here, you are there present while the audience is also there taking everything in. And another thing about this performance in particular is that, when it is simplified to this level, there's really so much vulnerability. There's only so much that you can present, and all of it has to be out there in the open.
Right. And the thing is, what would terrify me is that that direct interaction or even lack thereof. Because as, I guess, conventional artists, you're a little bit removed from your audience's responses. But as a performance artist, you are right there, whether the response be positive or negative, or even more petrifyingly, just not even present.
Yeah, and, she also mentions how, we usually think about the audience as the public in general, but not as individuals.
Right.
And here she has to make individual social connections with them.
That is true.
So, you are being put in a more vulnerable place. And we also live in a very virtual world these days. Like, I think in my day-to-day life, I barely make direct connections and interactions. I'm usually, talking to other people through different media.
Right.
Detached from them, or going on Facebook.
Especially nowadays.
Yeah, things like that. So it's quite interesting to think about really just honing in on that silence and directness that comes with being physically present and with someone.
And the thing is, and I do wonder if, defining it as art, if the moment an audience member steps onto the scene and faces the artist, does then that individual become a piece of art as well, or is that person still a spectator? That's very, very. It's definitely objective, depending on how you would look at it. That's very interesting.
It is a good question. Her artwork wouldn't be complete if none of the audience wanted to engage with her.
That's true.
So she is putting herself at risk in that way as well, and she is relying more on other people to make this work. And another thing that she talked about was how an atrium in the museum space is a very difficult space to work with because a lot of people are going in different directions. There's a lot of movement, hectic movement. And she wanted to offer stillness in the middle of it. She talks about how there's always stillness within chaos, like the eye of a storm. So I just think about that as well. Her sitting there silently, just sort of becoming this place of rest and connection and presence for her audience.
Which is a very ironic, almost a juxtaposition, because she is at the center of stillness, but all she sees from 360 degrees from an atrium is this kind of chaotic mingling of people, and most of their eyes would be upon her. So that is a very daunting task to be that centered in the middle of something that is so intimidating, really.
It really is, yeah.
So I do wonder how this experience has affected her. I mean, do we know anything about her, her, I guess, psyche or her mental state or health afterwards? I'd be really curious. That's definitely something
that's a great question.
Look into.
Yeah, and I think she in some ways is a very independent person and a private person, and she doesn't like sharing too much of her personal feelings.
I see.
She's a very strong person, and she's really great at sitting. This isn't the only work where she's just sat for a long time. But also she is, this is a very vulnerable thing to do. It's psychologically really tasking. So I think those are really great questions about,
Definitely,
what she might be experiencing.
Yeah, you've certainly opened my eyes, and I might go home and look more into this. Well, thank you, Christine, so much, and you have a wonderful evening.
Thank you, you too.